But I now want to talk about another aspect of this modern Jewish awakening in Eastern Europe, which is the development of the Jewish labor Bund. A subject dear to my heart, although I would not say that I'm a Bundist, but I believe in giving the Bund its share of respect. In a way, you can say that just as the Hasidic movement responded to a need in Jewish society, there were needs that developed in Jewish Eastern Europe in the 18th century, and there was a movement that developed. Nobody organized it, really. I mean, Dov Ber, yeah, but this need for heightened religious experience, for new kinds of community, for new kinds of leadership, these were needs that were in part met by Hasidism. And you could say by the same token that there was a great need in Jewish society in the early 20th century, late 19th century, that was met by the establishment of the Jewish labor Bund. The Jewish population increased 5 to 6 times. It increased from 1 million to 5 or 6 million. The shtetl safety net was no longer working. You had rapid urbanization. The Jewish population of Lodz goes to 250,000. The Jewish population of Warsaw goes to 375,000. And you have enormous new Jewish slums in these big cities. There was poverty in the shtetl, of course, plenty of poverty. But this poverty in these new urban slums was something of a new order of magnitude. And it was a life which was especially hard on women, on single women. There was a problem with the underworld, problem with extortionists, ongoing crime, ongoing violence, prostitution and brothels were a major issue. And the working conditions of the Jews in these new cities were absolutely frightful. Now again, I want to emphasize that Congress Poland, especially Lodz, I'm using the Yiddish pronunciation, not Łódź. By the way, does anybody know the name of the great Yiddish novel about Lodz? There's a great epic Yiddish novel about the I.J. Singer, the brothers Ashkenazi. Read it. There's also a great Polish novel about Łódź, the Promised Land, Ziemia Obiecana by Raymond. Lodz and Warsaw and Białystok became major industrial centers. In fact, Congress Poland became one of the economic hubs of the Russian Empire. Since there was no tariff between Poland and Russia, the Lodz textile factories, the Warsaw textile factories, the Białystok cigarette factories, and so on, could send their goods not just to Moscow, but to Siberia, and with the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway, even into the Far East. And so industry in Congress Poland boomed. But it's important to remember that there was a segregation in the labor market. The big factories, for the most part, did not hire Jews, even though the big factories were often owned by Jewish tycoons, like the Poznanskis or the Silversteins. And if you go to Lodz, you could see Poznanski's palace to this very day. The big factories hired only Polish workers. So Jews worked in little sweatshops. They worked in tiny shops where often the boss was just as poor as they were. They worked often on the putting out system, and that meant that profit margins had to be razor thin. Often the working day was 15, 16, 17 hours. Often workers worked all night Thursday to make up for the Shabbos that they weren't going to work. They had to show up Shabbos after Havdalah was over and get back on the job. Not only that, but they were often degraded in the workplace. A Jewish boy who became an apprentice often had to have his family pay the master to take him on as an apprentice. And then the first 2 or 3 years would be involved in taking care of the baby, helping the wife cook, helping household chores. It was only after a couple of years they'd even learn the rudiments of the trade. Pay was lower than in the big factories, even though the needs of Jewish workers were higher because they had to send their children to cheder, they had to pay for kosher food, and so on. So the Jewish working class was in a terrible condition, and women were in even worse condition. And there was this elemental need for yosher. Yosher is a Yiddish word which means justice. We want dignity. And when I.J. Singer and the brothers Ashkenazi talked about how the weavers in Lodge's Balut section, the worst slum in Lodge, got together after shul on Shabbos, and they decided they would form a union. And the decision to form a union was based on the Bible. It was based on those verses about social justice, about respect, about not oppressing the person who works for you, those verses that were found in the Jewish Bible. And so these Jewish workers resented being exploited. They resented being kicked and slapped by their bosses. Jewish women especially resented being sexually harassed, which often happened. And so you had this growing anger and this growing desperation in these huge urban slum districts. And that was one source of the energy which created the Bund. The other source which created the Bund came from a totally different direction. Russian-speaking, and in a few cases Polish-speaking, middle-class Jewish intellectuals who had no interest in Yiddish, no interest in Jewish culture, and who saw themselves as revolutionaries, as Marxists, or in some cases as populists. The Marxists concentrated on the urban workers, the populists concentrated on the peasants. Well, a lot of these Jewish intellectuals found that when they went to try to make contact with Russian or Polish workers or Russian peasants, they were not received very kindly. They were received with anti-Semitism. And then they began to realize that if they wanted to radicalize the working class, the Jewish workers were ready to fight.